Hello and welcome to Pod in My Backyard, the podcast for those of us who want to get on and solve the housing crisis. My name's Eve McQuillan. I'm a housing campaigner, an activist and a disgruntled private renter. And I am joined today by an American housing celebrity. We've got Shaun Donovan with us. Welcome to the podcast, Shaun.
Thanks, Eve. I'm not sure if that's a contradiction in terms, housing celebrity, but I am very, very happy to be here.
This pod gets a huge viewership and we're all celebrities. Now you've been on, you will be a celebrity. So welcome to the pod anyway.
Excited for that. Thank you.
Yes, brilliant. So Shaun is the former housing commissioner for New York under the then mayor, Mike Bloomberg. He was housing secretary under Obama and also budget director.
Correct.
And he is now the CEO of Enterprise Community Housing, which is the largest affordable housing provider in the US. But famously, he was also the
Designated survivor.
The designated survivor, if you've seen the Netflix series. So what was it like being holed up in a mountain trying to survive a nuclear war so that you could keep the US running?
Well, there's not so much I can tell you, otherwise I'd have to kill you, Eve. I'm sorry. But I will say it was the greatest James Bond moment of my life, being here in London. The crazy thing about it is that the extent of what we go to basically recreate the entire government for that moment, should something happen to the president, because everybody who's in the line of succession to the presidency is at the Capitol. So they take one person out. And I thought, I'd done it. I had my turn. And then all of a sudden, Kiefer Sutherland shows up on television playing a HUD secretary who used to be an architect. And I thought, maybe that's me. And in fact,
did they not come and talk to you first?
They didn't. I get no royalties out of it.
What?
It's crazy. But I do have the memories. And too bad I can't talk about them.
He knows where the big red button is, guys.
That's right.
So,
we did have the nuclear football with us.
wow. Okay, so after that bombshell, and I love that in this country we just don't bother unless someone attacks Parliament. Oh well. So what brings you to London?
Well, a little bit of a personal story. I lived here 52 years ago. My father's British, and so we spent a lot of time going back and forth across the pond, as they would say. And this trip, we were up in Scotland in the Highlands. I'm married to a landscape architect, and we went and saw the most beautiful gardens, visited Balmoral and many others. So I've had a chance with my 84-year-old father to spend a little time with family and friends up north. He was quite a serious golfer, played in the British Amateur over 60 years ago at St. Andrews, and so visited a few golf courses as well. But most importantly, I'm here to try to help you solve a housing crisis.
So we've got a housing crisis? I hadn't heard.
Well, we've got one in the U.S., if you haven't heard. As bad, I've been working in housing for 30 years. Yep. The crisis is as bad as I have ever seen. Rents, home prices went up more than we've ever seen since we started counting in the U.S. Homelessness in the U.S. is up 30% just in the last 2 years.
Explain to me how that has happened.
So what I would say is this crisis has been building for a long time. I was housing secretary. Many said told me I was crazy to take the job in the middle of our worst housing crisis. We had a mortgage crisis that caused a world economic crisis and the Great Recession. I'll never forget, I was working for Mike Bloomberg, and he famously had a bullpen, if you don't know those stories. He got rid of all offices. He gathered all the senior staff in one big room in cubicles in the center of City Hall called the bullpen. He loved that working style. It came from his Wall Street days. Hard to make phone calls, have any privacy.
Gossip.
But very good for communication. Anyway, we were all in the bullpen that day watching as the crisis was unfolding, watching our Congress try to pass a rescue bill that ended up going down in flames. And I'll never forget, we were all watching this on the big screen in the bullpen, and Mike Bloomberg walked in and said, "The world is ending." So I started as housing secretary in a complicated time. And since then, the U.S. just hasn't been building enough housing to keep up with our population growth. And so this crisis, our shortage, most economists say we're about 4 million units short of what we need in the U.S. We believe, my organization, my research team believes it's more like 7 million to get to real affordability. But that was building over time because our land use restrictions were getting worse and worse. There wasn't enough capital going to affordable housing. But then it really got turbocharged during COVID. It went from a chronic crisis to an acute crisis. Costs shot up, supply chains and all that. So it got much more expensive to build and renovate housing. But also people were demanding more housing. It's something we don't think a lot about. What's happening. There's all these empty offices. Where have those people gone to work? They're working at home. And so people who wanted 2 bedrooms before now wanted 3 bedrooms. Our sense in the U.S. is that demand for housing went up just like that in that moment when COVID happened, about 5 to 10%.
Okay,
and
because
so,
that preference shift.
Yeah.
And those who can pay are able to do that.
And
that
they squeeze out those who
out.
can't. Exactly right. And so we went from a problem that was building over a long time to rents and prices just shooting up during COVID.
Yeah, I mean, it's a similar story over here. Certainly the failure to build enough housing, failure to build enough affordable housing, that preference shift that we've seen in inner London with people wanting to live in inner London, and then that squeezing out people who've been in inner London for a long time. All of those similar themes coming through. But we like to talk about solutions on the podcast.
And there are solutions.
So there are solutions.
Some people don't believe it.
Building
but there
some
are.
homes.
Yes. Funny how that works.
Funny how that works. It turns out you can't solve a housing crisis without building homes, although the UK government has continued to try that policy for 20 years. But we have, some new guys who are keen to build homes, and there is legislation going through Parliament at the moment that should make it easier to at least get planning permission. But we have a crisis in affordable housing, particularly in London as well. We know that temporary accommodation is bankrupting councils. We know that 1 in every 30 children grows up homeless in the UK at the moment. We know that families are stuck in B&B accommodation for extended periods of time, and the modal time a child spends in temporary accommodation in the UK is 5 years, which is, utterly unacceptable in what remains a wealthy country. Now, you are here, I understand, to talk about a particular housing model, particular affordable housing model that may help us with some of these problems. So kick us off.
Absolutely. And I'm also here to learn, I would say, and to see what you're doing, and excited to bring some of what's working here in the UK back to the US.
Nothing's working, Shaun. Nothing's working.
I don't believe that. But what I will say is that there has been a movement in the US away from a system that is more like the UK's, of just giving grants for building affordable housing, to using our tax system to incentivize the building of affordable housing. And in fact, today, the single most important way that we build new affordable housing is through something called the low-income housing tax credit. And you may think to yourself, well, 6 of one, half a dozen the other. You give a grant, or you can use some other system to do it. And just to be explicit about how it works, is the government, the federal government says to corporations, if you invest equity, not debt, but actual equity, to build affordable housing, we will lower your taxes over the next 10 years. And so that is something that has done a couple of things that are really very powerful. It has engaged a whole new group of people and investors into affordable housing. And I think most importantly, gone from a system where the government is responsible for being real estate experts, which oftentimes government isn't so good at, to engaging people who can come in before a project is built and say, is this a project that will work? Is the team that's going to build it effective at building? And creates a real motivation to get it done, because the system is what we would call pay for success. You don't get $1 of these tax benefits until the project is actually built, completed, and occupied. And if you do a bad job of managing it over time, if it falls into disrepair, if you rent it to people who don't really need the housing, you can have the tax benefit taken away at any point. And that is a really powerful incentive. And so what we've seen is that compared to a system we had in place before, which was similar to the UK's, the level of disrepair, the level of failure or foreclosure of these projects is tiny, a fraction of 1%. And that's quite different from the experience that we've seen in other places. The other thing about it is that it has turned out to be a very, very flexible tool. We use it to build new affordable housing. Nonprofit organizations can use it. For-profit organizations, you've obviously developed a system in recent years to bring more housing developers into the affordable housing system. But it also can be used to build what we call supportive housing, what you call supported housing for formerly homeless people. 20% of all the tax credits that Enterprise has put out, hundreds of thousands of units in total, are focused on supported housing. But it can also be used to renovate and rebuild what we call public housing or your council housing. So it's a very flexible tool. You have to get private investors to come in to be what we call limited partners, investors in the project, but you can have any form of general partner or the owner and developer and manager of the project. So it's turned out to be quite a flexible system. And I think in the US, it gets the rents down to a level that somebody who's, below average income can afford. And then for the very lowest income, we use a additional tool to bring the rents down even further, what we would call rental assistance.
So similar to housing benefit or
yes.
universal credit
So
housing
here,
allowance.
what would be very powerful about it, I think, is that this would bring the cost down to a reasonable level, and those who have housing benefit could bring the rents down even further to a level that's truly affordable for them. And it would have the added benefit, I will say this as a former budget director, that currently your government is spending a lot of money helping people afford very high rents.
Yeah.
The more units you could build, the more apartments you could build with this low-income housing tax credit that would bring the rents down, the more it would lower what the government is spending on housing benefit, because rents would be coming down in a large number of units.
And would this kind of policy give people security? So one of the key issues with our private renter sector is the high rents, as you correctly allude to, and the fact that we spend so much public money propping up private landlords who've done very well out of a housing shortage, of course, with rising prices. And we spend taxpayers' money giving it pretty much directly to some of the wealthiest people in society. Not particularly sustainable or fair system, but people need support to have somewhere stable to live. But another of the issues is the constant churn and the difficulty people have staying. We've seen improvements to legislation recently, getting rid of no-fault evictions, but it's still difficult for people to stay and build community. One of the great things about council housing is the lifetime tenancies that it gave people. So that ability to put down roots, have a family, and know that your home was not going to be taken away. Can you ensure that people have stability within this kind of model?
Absolutely, yes. And to be clear, we have a system that's quite different from yours in the sense that most of the power in our political system, because we're a federalist system, resides with our states and our localities. And so we have a real patchwork across the U.S. of different rules about tenancy.
Yeah.
My hometown of New York City has a very well-developed rent control system that limits rents in private units, that protects against evictions. We have other states that have a very different system.
Yeah.
And what I would say is those are choices you can make almost independent of the focus of this program, the low-income housing tax credit. You could set up the system to require whatever protections you might want in that housing. We certainly do. The way our system works is that it's a very light touch from the federal government. Our Treasury Department that oversees the tax system sets the overall rules, but then the ability to allocate these credits, to award them to developers, goes to our states. So each state, each of our 50 states, can use it in different ways. We have some states that are much more rural and tend to focus it on building individual homes rather than apartment buildings. Some states have big demand for new housing. They use it for new construction. Others, you don't have a growing population, and so they use it for preserving and rebuilding existing housing. So there's a lot of flexibility around that. For the individuals, there are two ways I would get directly to your question. One is there are very specific rent limits, which means that you create a lot more stability. We have a lot of evidence that children do better in school. They have greater economic success in the long run when they live in this kind of housing because it does create more stability. The amount that you can charge for rent is limited to 30% of a typical person's income. And the amount that you can raise those rents every year is capped based on that system. So you create a lot of stability through the individual way that rents are set for the properties, and that allows a family. What's also interesting about it is that even if your income goes above the restrictions, you can remain in that apartment for a longer period of time. And so it doesn't have this perverse incentive that some programs older programs in the U.S. had, where you were disincentivized to earn more money, right? You can, to your point, you can actually stay in your community even if you're doing better economically. So those are important pieces of it. The other way I would approach it, and this has been a tension in the U.S., too often we've had programs that had limited affordability requirements. So in other words, you sign up for, and this is the way the low-income housing tax credit originally started, is you only had to comply for 15 years. And then you could convert the project to a market rent and raise the rents. And that introduced real instability.
Scary, frankly, from a social policy perspective.
Yes, yeah. and it's created real issues in the U.S. Yeah. And frankly, it's both destabilized families and communities. It's also meant that the government has to spend again to preserve the property. Yeah. So what's ended up happening is that we now have a 30-year affordability requirement, but many states are going well beyond that to 50 years or even permanent affordability. Yeah. And as I've been reading a little bit about the debate that's happening here in the UK, this is a policy choice, and I'm certainly a fan of saying make it permanently affordable. If you're going to get this investment, have a requirement that you keep the rents capped for the life of the project. And that's certainly something that you could do to introduce even more stability. I'm a big believer in that, and I think it has been one of the, particularly early on, the downfalls of the program in the U.S. is that it didn't have long enough affordability requirements for the project.
And if this big tax rebate goes into it, or this big tax discount goes into it, effectively the state subsidising it, but through a different model, who ends up owning this housing? So in the UK, if you like, our gold standard social housing is council housing built by the public sector and owned by the public sector. We've seen lots of council housing transferred to housing associations, ostensibly not-for-profits. Some of them are great, some of them standards aren't great. But they have, directors who earn a lot of money, etc., they're closer to a corporate model. We are very skeptical of private ownership of public housing because we've seen privatisation in the UK driving down standards and that security that we would like to see. So we're very attached to that gold standard kind of council housing model. But I am also acutely aware that we're in a time when borrowing for the government is very expensive, and there is a real difficulty in being able to keep the UK paying its interest payments if we are to borrow as much as we need for the affordable housing that we need. So tell me a little bit more about a model where I know that you've said that sometimes non-profit organisations can make use of this, but the private end of this, what does that look like? How is that, I guess, safe and protected? Because I am a little nervous about private investors running some of the UK's social housing.
Yeah. So first, let me just say, and as I understand it, this is one of the things that has really made this conversation urgent in the UK, is that your debt levels, I am a former budget director of the US. We have similar challenges in the US today. Our debt levels are rising. And it is harder and harder to find new capital, new grants, given those budget limits. What is attractive about the way the low-income housing tax credit works is you are not allocating capital up front. As I said earlier, you're only awarding these tax credits once the project is built. So it's a pay for success. But it is also awarded over time, and it's a reduction of future income rather than a grant of current government dollars. So it does not count against the capital investments of the government in the same way. So one, from a budgeting perspective, it's a very different system and a much more attractive system that would allow you to get private investment today without having the same level of government spending. So that's first. The second thing I would say...
Is that, just to come on to that though, is that not shoring up problems for later? But money that might be needed won't be there anymore.
Well, what we've seen in the US is that housing is such an important economic generator.
Yep.
So the money that goes into construction creates jobs, creates tax payments.
Yeah.
So there's a virtuous cycle.
Okay.
And particularly at a moment where there's such a shortage of housing in the UK and in the US, there's lots of economic evidence that these projects pay for themselves effectively
And the housing
in the
crisis,
long run.
of course, causes a lot of misery for individuals, but is also very expensive. Very expensive to keep people in temporary accommodation, very expensive to transfer lots of public money to private landlords.
Not to mention the long-term costs of children not being successful in their educations, not being able to find jobs.
Health impacts.
The health impacts, the very long-term impacts. I think it's, I would argue there's no question this pays for itself.
Okay.
Those are harder to measure.
Yeah, I mean, issues of justice, certainly social justice, but if they can be economically quantified as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we have more and more evidence in the US that those long-term impacts for children and families far outweigh the upfront costs of doing this. But I've also been a budget director and know that we wonky types in government have a hard time counting those.
Yeah.
So the other thing I would say, just to get back to your question, and I don't want to get too wonky here, but
we love wonky.
to be very specific, you have two different roles in these projects. Technically, they're called limited partners and general partners, but think of it as investors and then actual owners and managers of the projects, right? So these limited partners are the ones who get the tax benefits. Think of banks, other corporations. They're putting money into these projects to build it in exchange for a flow of tax benefits over 10 years.
Okay.
But that doesn't say that the organization that's building the housing, owning the housing, managing the housing has to be a for-profit. And in fact, in the US, a huge amount of the housing that's built is nonprofit built, We have increasingly our public housing authorities. So these are government owners, our equivalent of social housing, council housing here. The tax credit is increasingly the primary way that they are building and renovating affordable housing. And so this is a system that really allows you to get what we would think of as the discipline of the private sector, a judgment. As I said earlier, the government isn't always the best at knowing whether a project will last for the long term, but you can get all the benefits of permanently mission-oriented housing organizations, public bodies, nonprofits, and you could choose not to have for-profit owners. We've chosen to have for-profit owners and managers of the, but those are policy choices that you can make. So I would separate out the tool here.
Yeah.
This is a way of bringing capital into housing that I think is a better system than the traditional grant structure. But you can also separate that from who's actually owning and managing the housing, and you could decide to focus it only on the housing owners, the housing managers that you believe are the best.
Okay, so talk me through how it works if it's publicly owned housing, how it might work in the UK. So if I run a council, we want to build more council homes, we want to get more money into the system, how would this work for us? Would we be able to sell on the credit? And is that how they would generate investment?
Yes, exactly. So an owner of council housing, your local authority, could put together a legal structure, a limited partnership is what we call it, where the tax investors would be basically silent partners, right? Think of it, it's not different. And we've had these debates in the US. Is it privatizing the housing? Is it not? What are the risks? You already have the ability to go raise debt, right? You can go to the capital markets, bonds, you can go to banks for debt. Think of it in a similar way. There is an ownership interest that a bank has with debt, right? There's a foreclosure right often, but you can structure it so that you protect the affordability. You can still have a requirement that the housing remain affordable. You can replace an owner, replace a manager. And so you have similar kinds of rights that exist for the private investor. Think of it as similar to going and getting a loan, right? And the risks that come with that, but also the benefits. It allows you to raise far more capital to do renovations and other things. So that's a simple view. I could get a lot more detail about how these are structured, how the payments come in. One of the things that's important, and this is the role my organization plays, we're a nonprofit, and we're what's called a syndicator of affordable housing.
Okay.
So the basic idea is we go out to the markets, we go out to banks and other investors. We have a very long track record in doing this, and we say to them, we're putting together a fund, call it a $1 billion fund, and we are going to use that once we raise it to invest in these projects. And we will guarantee to you that we will oversee the project, we'll make sure it gets built effectively, that the management happens. We do all of what's called asset management. And so a bank who may not know anything about how to build housing, right, can be assured by working with us that this project is going to be built effectively and managed effectively. So we are an intermediary between those investors and the nonprofit or other owners of the housing. We're mission oriented. We're very focused, as I said earlier. A large share of what we do is invest in supportive housing for formerly homeless folks. We work with a lot of small nonprofits who may not have built a project before or not have a lot of experience. We bring them what we call technical assistance and help to get the project. So as a syndicator, as an intermediary in this, that role has developed around this program in the U.S. in a way that's been quite helpful to both parties, to the private parties who don't want to necessarily develop a whole expertise, but they want the tax benefits, and to the local owners who may not want to understand all the complexities of the way this tool works.
Okay, interesting. So this is potentially a way in the UK, I guess, to get private investment into housing that's a social good, potentially long-term private investment, pension funds, etc., that's quite stable, and then get that doing something kind of useful within the economy that we actually need to
Absolutely.
happen. So
And what's happened in the U.S. is that as we've developed more and more expertise, the system has become extremely efficient.
Okay.
And so these credits have the price for them, the amount of capital that you're able to raise to go into projects has gotten larger and larger over time because the system has become more and more efficient.
And let's talk about how it drives up standards. So we have real problems in terms of the quality of some of our social housing, particularly with the big housing associations. We have a labyrinthine scheme of regulation, which is very difficult to access if you have a complaint. I mean, I've seen terrible things in terms of disrepair, raw sewage in disabled people's bathrooms, that kind of thing, and housing associations just not really dealing with these problems because there isn't enough of a check and balance within the system. When your landlord is your local authority, you can turn up at your councillor's surgery and berate them. There is a democratic check and balance there. When your landlord is the C word, which is Clarion, you can't do that. And we've seen the government really fail to give regulation its teeth. We have an ombudsman that you have to wait 8 weeks after you've been through a long complaints procedure to even access, and then it might hand down a judgment. But really the incentive isn't to find these organisations, because if we find these organisations, well, they can take that off the money that they would be putting towards other affordable housing, meaning that more people languish on waiting lists. So there isn't really an effective way we've found of regulating housing that is social housing within these housing associations. And we, in a private market, you might say that people would be able to vote with their feet to get out of the bad quality housing. Doesn't happen when you've got a shortage, of course. But within the social housing market, people are there with their lifetime tenancy. It's very difficult to move on. And if you have a bad landlord, there's very little you can do to actually get your issues resolved.
Yeah. So what's interesting about that question to me is it goes back to why the low-income housing tax credit was first created in the U.S. for exactly the reasons you just described. So we had a system that originally started with what's called public housing, very similar to council housing. This is government developed, owned, and managed, right? It's owned by local government authorities. We call them public housing authorities in the U.S. And there are thousands of them in the U.S. that developed it through a grant system like you described. Because that housing was falling into disrepair for a whole set of reasons that we could spend, a full hour talking about, underfunding, lack of accountability, and frankly, we had some local housing authorities that just weren't good at owning and managing housing. And exactly as you said, the accountability was limited. We developed a system for private owners called Section 8, which had some of the same problems. They were awarded for political reasons. They ended up being mismanaged and often didn't have enough money to keep them up. And so in reaction both to public ownership and private ownership of affordable housing ending up in bad quality with lack of accountability, this low-income housing tax credit system was created in 1986 as an alternative. And why has it worked better? I would really say a couple things about that. One is that this is not dependent on a government actor, whether it be a government owner of housing performing well or government regulating well a private owner, because right up front, you've said not only does government have to choose this project, but you have to have private investors who, under penalty of huge financial, catastrophic impact for them to take away these tax benefits, you've got to have a private owner who's saying, this is a project that actually gets built. You don't even get the tax credits awarded until it's built at a sufficient level of quality. So
and who checks that? Where does that penalty come in the system? How does that work?
So that comes from not only a government body, so our state housing authorities, right? But if I'm a investor in the tax credit and as a syndicator, right, we work with those investors, we will send in an inspector and say, we will not put the funding into this until this project is at a sufficient level of quality. So you have both a government body that can do that, but you also have the private investor themselves. And we're motivated to do that. We represent those investors because otherwise we know that there's a huge risk. There's no incentive for us to put those dollars in unless the project is actually built. And political incentive doesn't drive us, right? It is really about making sure there's an economic incentive to get the project built, right? And then the management over time, again, it's essentially a belt and suspenders kind of system. You have both.
What's a belt and suspenders kind of system?
Sorry, a belt in the U.S. we talk
Sounds
about
quite rude.
Belt and suspenders is being you have both the belt and the suspenders holding up your pants.
Braces.
Right? So much less risk.
Very different.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry. Braces.
Yes.
So that's a system where you basically have checks and balances built in that have proven to be very effective, right? You have annual checks on the quality. You have annual checks to make sure that renting to the right people. And again, you both have government ability to check that, but you also have a very significant private incentive to make sure that it's managed well.
Yeah.
And in fact, the system has been in place since 1986. As I think I said earlier, the level of failure, the level of foreclosure, non-compliance is tiny.
Yeah.
Less than a small percentage of 1%. So that is, seeing is believing.
Yeah, I mean that's a good rate, and I can see that there is, there's clear teeth there, which in the UK system there just aren't teeth to drive up standards. Really, apart from the democratic check and balance, there's no teeth within the housing association system. What happens to those people in the less than 1% where it goes wrong?
We, as a syndicator, deal with those examples. We have had through COVID and other things, costs rising. You've got the same situation happening here. It's harder and harder to make ends meet for these projects, even if you're doing a good job managing them. So we as an investor or representing the investors are so motivated to keep those tax benefits flowing. We will, in some cases, advance dollars to the project. If it is a problem with the ownership, and that will be to do capital improvements, to make sure that loans are paid or staff is paid at the properties. But in the extreme cases where it's a problem with the owner and manager, we will replace them. We have a number of cases where we will say to the owner, I'm sorry, you're not doing a good enough job. You either have to sell the project to an owner who will do a good job. You have to replace your management team, whatever is necessary. And within the
contracts, you have the legal power to be able to do that.
Exactly. Exactly. And so it's similar in a bank situation, right, where you have a loan, there would be similar rights to be able to cure those kind of deficiencies and keep the tax benefits flowing. So it is a tiny fraction, but there also has developed an effective system to do that. I want to come back to your question though, and talk about it in a slightly different way, because what I've also seen over time, and we're still seeing this. We still have. Originally, we had close to 2 million units of public housing in the U.S. That number has gone down substantially because of failures of the housing, but we still have a substantial number of those units. And what we've seen is that the political constituency for those grant programs in the U.S. has been quite limited. Where you have government owning and operating housing, you essentially have two political constituencies. You have the residents of that housing, and then you have the authorities, right? The owners of that housing. And what we've seen is that funding over the long term declines, that there isn't the public support there needs to be. So one of the reasons in the US, and I would guess in the UK as well, that you have conditions that are poor, that the quality of the housing is declining, is because there hasn't been the funding over time, because the budgets are tight, to be able to really invest in this housing in the way that we should. To be very specific, our public housing in the US, we estimate, has over $100 billion of capital needs right now that are unmet.
Yeah.
And that has not been enough to move our Congress to increase funding. And it's going to get worse because our budget challenges are growing in the U.S., as they are here. What's different about this tax credit system is it has broad political support that has meant that is consistently being invested in. And let's just speak about what's happening right now. We have a huge, you may have heard, we have a big tax debate that's happening in our Congress right now. We expect this summer a very large tax bill to get passed. Both Republicans and Democrats agree that the low-income housing tax credit is worth not just maintaining, but expanding. The House of Representatives, Republican-led, in a highly partisan bill, included a 12.5% increase in the low-income housing tax credit. So this is, from my perspective, leave aside the policy, from a political perspective, having a program that has many stakeholders, public stakeholders, but also private stakeholders, that has a track record of success, means that I, as a housing advocate, have a huge amount of confidence that this system will last over time and will have broad bipartisan support at a time where almost nothing has bipartisan support in the U.S. And so I think, leaving aside all the policy arguments, although it's connected to the policy side, the political argument for a system like this is quite powerful.
I think that's quite interesting because the UK's political system, so I wouldn't say that the Tory party, would be very careful with my words, I wouldn't say that the right in the UK is against social housing as a concept. Certainly amongst Reform voters, a very right-wing party, there is a lot of support for council housing. Even within the Conservative government, there is a recognition that there is a need to build more social housing. It's expensive to do so. Our problem really with disrepair is because a lot of stuff was built in the 50s and 60s, and a lot of it was built with concrete frames, and that gets very damp, and that causes lots of health problems. It's expensive to repair. We then, of course, have had the building safety crisis following Grenfell Tower, and lots of costs put onto housing associations. So genuinely, I do feel a little bit of sympathy for some of the big housing associations that have had huge building safety bills, and they, by definition, haven't been able to put up rents to pay for that. And they've got themselves in a bit of a financial mangle. So I don't think our politics is in a place where there isn't support for social housing. The problem is that it is very expensive and the need is so great. And it's how do you build at the scale that we need whilst repairing the stuff that we've got and introduce that accountability. And it is difficult to kind of square that circle because borrowing is so expensive at the moment. You know, with the best will in the world, even a more left-wing Labour government would come into issues with borrowing at the scale that we need to build the social housing that we need, which is why people are excited to talk about this model.
Yeah. Well, far be it from me to talk about your politics with
please.
you.
That's why you're on the show.
I would say, you know, you have an unusual moment with a housing crisis that is deeper and broader than it's been ever.
Since Napoleon was around.
But I'm really talking about political support over decades, right? Through good times and bad. You've had periods where there wasn't such broad political support for council housing. Yeah. You've had periods of selling off council housing, which
the right to buy.
Yes, which is controversial at best, right? And so I'm really thinking in terms of decades, right? This program was created in 1986, and it's been able to maintain broad bipartisan support coming up on 40 years now. And so when you're building housing, as you talked about eloquently before, we're talking about very long-term investments for families, for communities, that this housing should be around forever, right? Should be affordable forever. And that political support, I think, is harder, first. And second, support is one thing, but will you prioritize spending in an extremely tight budget? And the truth is, there hasn't been enough funding, right? For whatever reason.
Yep.
Yeah, despite political support. And what this offers, I think, is not just, moral support or speaking up about your support, but actually putting your money where your mouth is, as we like to say, and voting for a program that actually can produce that investment. And part of that, you will often hear Republicans in Congress say, "Oh no, I'm for housing. I'm just not for the federal government doing it directly. The federal government has been bad at it, right? There's a plenty of history of it not working well, of public housing failing. Fairly or not, that's the argument that would be made. And what this offers is a way to say, this is a highly successful public-private partnership. It's a way that devolves responsibility down to government that is closer to the ground, that understands local needs better. And so
only all local authorities were that way.
Yes.
But yes.
But at the state, again, for us, it's the state level.
The state level.
And I do think this is an interesting, for you all, in designing a system like that, like the low-income housing tax credit, should it get to that point, deciding how it's overseen, whether it's regional, whether it's local authorities, how to do that is a really important policy choice, because you do need our states. There are only 50 of them in the U.S., and they do have state housing agencies. They have organizations that are quite good in general at doing the kind of work of allocating and overseeing it. And so developing that muscle, if you will, is going to be an important part of developing this policy.
And what would you say, I guess, to the left who would like to see, I'd like to see the government putting money in to gain assets. And then, if you have an asset, you can then borrow off the value of that asset, and you can expand the number of assets you have, which is what we see within our housing revenue accounts with our council housing. Does this rob the government of the opportunity to build up assets?
And sorry, just to make sure I understand, government-owned assets, you're saying? No. In fact, what we've designed...
So it's not instead of, it's as well as.
Going back to what I was saying earlier, you can have any kind of owner of the housing in the long term, right? You have the limited partners that come in that get the tax benefits. Those have to be private entities. They have to be tax-paying entities. But the general partner, the one who develops the project and owns it long term, can be a government actor. And in fact, one of the things that we've built into this system is a right of first refusal, where at the end of the 15 years that an investor, and not to be clear, you get the tax benefits over 10 years.
Okay.
There is a 15-year requirement for compliance that the state agency oversees the project.
Okay.
And then there's an affordability requirement that is at least 30 years and can be longer. So there's some different pieces in here. But the long story short, the original investor that buys those tax credits can exit at 15 years. If they exit, the general partner has a right of first refusal. What does that mean? If you have a local authority that uses this tax credit to build a new project, to build an asset in the terms that you just, that local authority could have the ability to buy the project or even have it gifted, depending on how you write the contract, at the end of those 15 years. And so this is a very direct way, without having to have a new budget for grants, to be able to create more government assets, to create more social housing in the long term. It's all about how you design the policy and the choices that you would make in doing that. And I do think, in my view, the mistake we've made in the U.S., which you should not make, is not maximizing the affordability right up front.
Right.
Human beings are short-sighted by nature. Investors, if you tell them you're going to get these benefits over 10 years and they will price that, don't give them anything else. Make sure that they're not able to sell the property at market rate. Make sure that they're not getting a residual ownership interest. Structure the projects, in fact, the program from the beginning, where you could have whoever is the general partner get the property at the end of 15 years. And then they own it free and clear, because in many cases, there's no debt on these properties at this point. So it can be a powerful way to create new government assets if the program is structured in the right way from the beginning.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So we're coming close to the end. This is an exciting model. You are a real evangelist for the model as well. So I'm excited to know really how housing policy worked during the Obama years, and some of the successes you had.
Yeah.
And I guess also to touch on, if this model is so great, why is homelessness in the US up 30%? Is it because there's not enough of it, and we need to see more of this, or are there some problems in the system still?
Yeah. So one is, we're not doing enough of this. There is every dollar of low-income housing tax credit that it's allocated by the states is hugely competitive. We could build depending on the state, 5 to 10 projects for every one that's actually awarded. So we have a desperate shortage. We need more, and there's bipartisan recognition of that.
Okay.
That's why there's a 12.5% increase built into the House bill, and we expect the Senate to do the same thing. But what I would also say, and this is where we can learn from you, the government can subsidize, whether through a grant or a tax credit, 100% of the construction of a project, right? You can build it debt-free, but it's still true that a very low-income person can't afford just what it takes to keep up that unit,
Okay.
right? The utilities, the maintenance, the personnel working on the property. That might be 400, 500 pounds a month, even more, just to operate that project, right? And no matter how good a capital tool is, right, like a low-income housing tax credit or a grant, you still need what we would call rental assistance. You still need some way to pay the ongoing expenses of running that property.
Or a fair society that raises people's incomes at the same time.
That would work
That
too.
would be great, you know.
Could you fix that?
Yeah, I can.
You'll have that done by next week. And so in the US, unlike here, we do not have an entitlement for very low income people to pay the rent.
Okay.
We don't have a housing benefit.
Right.
We have something called housing vouchers or other forms of rental assistance. For every family that's income qualified that gets that help, there are 3 more families in the US who don't.
Wow.
Only 1 out of 4 gets it.
Bureaucracy and hurdles, and you have
No.
to apply on a Tuesday at 3 p.m. to get anything?
That is a lack of political will. Full stop. We have not decided in the United States that housing is a right. And we have a right to public education. We have a right to Social Security. We largely have a right to medical assistance in the U.S. We do not have a right to housing. And for me, that is the biggest failure of the U.S. To stand up and say, this is something everybody should have. It is a fundamental foundation to everything else we do in life to succeed. I believe that, but we as a country have not taken the steps to make that true. And so that's the fundamental issue. We need more low-income housing tax credits, but it also has to be paired with an operating subsidy, rental assistance, whatever you want to call it, that allows the very lowest income, folks who are ending up on the streets more and more, to be able to afford it. And I will say, it's gotten to the point where we are losing faith in the U.S. That homelessness is a solvable problem. And just going back to your question, one of my proudest achievements in the Obama administration is that we made such remarkable progress on homelessness. We cut family and what we call chronic homelessness, long-term homelessness, by about 1/3 during that period. We cut veterans' homelessness in half in the U.S. When we started, a veteran was twice as likely as an average person in the U.S. to be homeless, twice as likely. And we reversed that. And in fact, in 100 cities and states around the country, we eliminated veteran homelessness, got it to 0. And so we showed that homelessness is a solvable problem with the right tools, the right approach. And that was something not only I'm proud of, but most importantly, that I think we as President Obama, everyone in the administration came together and said, this is a priority.
Yeah.
It is wrong that we have any American, much less a veteran, sleeping on our streets.
Yeah. Brilliant. I mean, that's wonderful, wonderful stuff, and great to see the difference that power and a position can make. Thank you very much for joining me, Shaun. This has been fascinating. But before I go, I have one last question for you, which is, did your son beat Barack Obama at ping pong?
Yes, he did. In fact, when I will say, please don't tell President Obama this, but
I don't think he listens to the pod. He should.
The first person in my family to support President Obama was my then 9-year-old son, Milo. He became a huge fan. He had a lemonade stand on our stoop in Brooklyn called Thirsty for Change. Made $400 for the Obama campaign. Yeah, this was
how much was he charging for the lemonade?
This was very high priced heirloom hand squeezed Brooklyn lemonade. Hipster lemonade. And was just a huge fan. And so met President Obama very briefly at my swearing in as HUD secretary. But more importantly, when we went back for the Super Bowl party, this is our football, not proper football, there was a ping pong table there. And my son at the time, he was 9, loved playing ping pong. So he said, "Dad, come and play with me." And I played with him. But the president walked by and said, "Hey, Milo, you're pretty good. Let's play." So let's play to 5. Well, Milo beats him to 5. President Obama's pretty competitive.
Yeah.
He says, home court rules, we're playing to 10. Milo beats him to 10. At this point, I'm starting to think, is this a firing offense? Like, if your son beats the president in ping pong, do you lose your job? Like, how does this work? So I'm like, start making, stop it, Milo. And Obama looks at Milo and says, Milo, play your hardest. We're playing to 21.
Oh, no.
And he beat him to
He
21.
beat him to 21. Wow.
So-
Well done, Milo. That's brilliant.
And I still lasted 8 years in the cabinet.
You did fine.
I guess
He
it
knew-
wasn't
he
a
needed
firing
you.
offense.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for joining me today. Thanks, Shaun. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
And thank you for listening.